February 1943. In the smoldering aftermath of the Battle of Kasserine Pass, German intelligence evaluated their first encounter with American troops. The verdict was brutal. They were dismissed as merely Italians with better equipment. During one interrogation, a German officer bluntly informed a captured American commander that his newly drafted civilian army was fundamentally unfit for the ruthless reality of mechanized warfare. According to rigid German military doctrine, a force built practically from scratch just 2 years prior could never survive against battle-hardened Wehrmacht veterans. The Americans were bleeding in the desert, stepping blindly into a mathematically precise meat grinder, seemingly doomed to total annihilation. Yet, within less than 24 months, those same green, retreating units would be crashing through the Siegfried Line and crossing the Rhine, systematically dismantling the most professional military machine in Europe. This presents one of the greatest historical paradoxes of the Second World War. How did a military establishment that, just 4 years prior in 1939, ranked 19th in global strength, fielding an active army actually smaller than that of Romania, transform into a continent-crushing juggernaut? The answer is not a simple myth of inherent American bravery or just a brute force application of endless assembly lines, but a deliberate, brutal evolution in tactical doctrine. This investigation will deconstruct how the United States engineered a radically new paradigm of warfare. It was a highly adaptable system, built on the ruthless efficiency of global industrial logistics, the unprecedented integration of instant forward radio communication, and the uniquely decentralized tactical initiative granted to frontline sergeants and non-commissioned officers. The German General Staff was observing an enemy they fundamentally miscategorized. They measured the American combatant against their own traditional metrics of centuries-old martial heritage and rigid operational theory. What the Wehrmacht High Command failed to comprehend was that they were facing a rapidly learning, highly decentralized organism that weaponized flexibility. They remained completely blind to this modern command structure until it was actively tearing their defensive perimeters apart. To understand the sheer scale of this violent transformation and how a deeply disadvantaged, inexperienced draft force managed to achieve total lethal overmatch in such a highly compressed time frame, we have to rewind the clock. We must first examine the deeply flawed, threadbare foundation the American ground forces actually started with, and dissect exactly why German intelligence officers were mathematically certain that the United States could never field a functional army in time to matter. In September 1939, when the Wehrmacht tore through Poland utilizing synchronized armor, motorized infantry, and devastating close air support, the United States Army was little more than an antiquated constabulary force. General George C. Marshall took the oath as Army Chief of Staff on the very day Hitler's panzers crossed the Polish border, inheriting an active military of fewer than 190,000 men. The United States ranked 19th in global military power, fielding a smaller standing army than Portugal or Romania. Its soldiers trained with wooden rifles, utilized delivery trucks painted with the word tank, and communicated with signal flags because modern field radios were critically scarce. Marshall faced an unprecedented, almost mathematically impossible nightmare. In order to prepare for a looming two-front global war, he had to expand this tiny, obsolete force into an army of millions, and he had to do it before the Axis powers completely locked down the European and Asian continents. The passage of the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940 triggered the first peacetime draft in American history, suddenly flooding federal training camps with millions of civilians who had never held a weapon, marched in formation, or operated within a rigid hierarchy. The immediate crisis facing the War Department was not merely a severe lack of modern rifles or artillery pieces. It was a catastrophic deficit of leadership. A mobilized army of this staggering scale required hundreds of thousands of officers and non-commissioned officers to train, discipline, and ultimately lead raw recruits into live combat. The small, isolated cadre of regular Army professionals was spread impossibly thin, stretched to the breaking point, just trying to organize the intake of draftees. To rapidly plug this immense command vacuum, the War Department radically expanded the officer candidate school system. They took college graduates, administrative clerks, and promising enlisted draftees, ran them through a highly compressed, intensely grueling 90-day curriculum, and pinned gold second lieutenant bars on their collars. These men became universally known as the 90-day wonders. Civilians transformed into battlefield commanders virtually overnight. While they possessed earnest dedication and patriotism, they completely lacked the intuitive grasp of combat dynamics, the deeply rooted martial tradition, and the years of tactical field experience that defined the professional officer classes of Europe. Consequently, the War Department, heavily guided by Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, the architect of the Army Ground Forces, had no choice but to institute a highly centralized, rigidly standardized training doctrine. Because there was simply no time to cultivate tactical genius or independent battlefield philosophy among tens of thousands of newly minted, inexperienced officers, the system had to be idiot-proof. The American military machine was forced to rely on the strict, absolute adherence to standardized field manuals, specifically FM 100-5, Field Service Regulations. Every infantry maneuver, every artillery barrage, and every logistical supply line was meticulously choreographed by the book. The American command structure was deliberately built to function much like a Detroit industrial assembly line, predictable, sequential, mass-produced, and heavily managed from the top down. Orders flowed uniformly from generals down to colonels to captains, and finally down to the green lieutenants, who were expected to execute them exactly as written in the manual. Across the Atlantic, intelligence analysts within the German High Command, particularly within the department known as Fremde Heere West, or Foreign Armies West, closely monitored this massive overseas mobilization. As they scrutinized American organizational charts, analyzed intercepted training doctrines, and reviewed after-action reports from early engagements in North Africa, the German General Staff was profoundly unimpressed. The German military apparatus operated under a fundamentally opposing philosophy of warfare, one born from centuries of Prussian martial tradition. They relied heavily on Auftragstaktik, commonly translated as mission-type tactics. In the Wehrmacht, a senior commander gave his subordinates a clear objective, provided the necessary resources, and defined the timeline. But he deliberately did not dictate exactly how to achieve it. The method of execution was left entirely to the discretion of the officers and non-commissioned officers on the ground. These frontline leaders were expected to constantly read the chaotic flow of battle, instantly adapt to unforeseen circumstances, seize fleeting tactical opportunities, and act with extreme, decentralized aggression, without ever waiting for permission from a higher headquarters. This highly fluid system required a deeply ingrained warrior ethos, immense mutual trust across the ranks, and a highly professional officer and NCO corps, trained from youth in the brutal art of war. Looking at the frenetic American buildup, the German intelligence directorate saw an army that represented the exact antithesis of Auftragstaktik. They observed a cumbersome, top-heavy, deeply bureaucratic organization desperately trying to lead a conscripted mass of former mechanics, farmers, and store clerks. The Germans noted the rigid American reliance on centralized operational planning and detailed, step-by-step orders that left little room for spontaneous battlefield intuition. To a Prussian-trained staff officer, a military doctrine that practically required a second lieutenant to wait for radio confirmation from a battalion commander before shifting a platoon's axis of advance was a fatal structural vulnerability. It was a centralized system that might work flawlessly on a peaceful, highly controlled parade ground in Georgia or Texas, but it was one that the Germans believed was guaranteed to shatter upon first contact with the fluid, hyper-violent reality of modern mechanized combat. These intelligence assessments delivered to Berlin painted a deeply comforting picture of a technologically wealthy but tactically bankrupt adversary. German generals, many of whom belonged to aristocratic families with military lineages dating back to the campaigns of Frederick the Great, simply could not fathom that an army commanded by recently deputized accountants and school teachers could ever hold its ground against the hardened, deeply experienced veterans of the Eastern Front. They formulated a clear, highly logical hypothesis regarding American battlefield behavior. The German theory held that the moment a meticulously planned American operation encountered unexpected heavy resistance, the rigid top-down command structure would immediately seize up. Because the American training doctrine heavily centralized decision-making and seemingly did not encourage independent initiative at the squad or platoon level, German strategists firmly believed that neutralizing the leadership would trigger an immediate systemic collapse. The tactical solution seemed obvious. If the Wehrmacht focused its machine gun, mortar, and sniper fire specifically on the American officers, the men carrying the radios, reading the maps, and pointing the way, the heavily equipped but poorly seasoned enlisted men would quickly descend into total tactical paralysis. Without an officer to tell them where to maneuver, and utterly lacking an aristocratic cultural tradition of martial independence, the German assessment concluded that the American infantrymen would simply freeze in place. They would hug the dirt, wait for instructions that would never arrive, and allow themselves to be systematically surrounded and dismantled by by highly aggressive, decentralized German counterattacks. It was an elegant, mathematically sound deduction, based entirely on every metric of military science and cultural superiority the German High Command held dear. This assessment rapidly became the foundational assumption of the German defensive strategy in the West. As the months of 1943 bled into 1944, a colossal, unavoidable collision course was set in motion. Millions of these raw, rigidly trained American recruits, equipped with a staggering volume of industrial hardware, were steadily loading onto vast transport armadas, sailing relentlessly toward a European continent controlled by a highly adaptable, fiercely decentralized military apparatus. The clock was ticking down to a clash not just of immense armies, but of two completely incompatible philosophies of human warfare. The German High Command waited with cold, professional confidence, fully expecting the cumbersome American war machine to inevitably crack apart the moment it was forced to operate outside the safe, predictable margins of its field manuals. The ultimate bloody test of this German theory arrived in the claustrophobic death trap of the Normandy hedgerows in the summer of 1944. The Normandy bocage was a geographical nightmare that actively defied standardized tactics. Across the Cotentin Peninsula, thousands of small farming plots were boxed in by ancient earthen embankments, thick with tangled roots. This terrain completely neutralized American mechanized mobility. It was the perfect environment for a deeply entrenched defense, and German forces utilized it to execute their command decapitation strategy with ruthless precision. In the opening weeks of the invasion, as American units pushed into claustrophobic sunken roads, German snipers and MG-42 gunners deliberately targeted the identifiable markers of American leadership. They looked for the vertical white stripe painted on an officer's helmet. They shot the men carrying map cases and shouting orders. In the first chaotic minutes of a hedgerow ambush, it was common for an American platoon to lose its lieutenant almost immediately. According to the intelligence models formulated in Berlin, this was the precise moment the rigid American machine was supposed to break. Deprived of the officers who understood the operational blueprints, the green drafted infantrymen were expected to freeze, succumb to tactical paralysis, and wait to be dismantled. But as German defenders watched from their concealed positions, the anticipated collapse never came. Instead, they witnessed a terrifying, unexpected phenomenon. When a lieutenant fell, a 22-year-old corporal from Ohio, or a drafted mechanic from Brooklyn, simply picked up the radio and seamlessly assumed command. They did not wait for formalized orders from a battalion headquarters miles to the rear. The sudden vacuum of leadership triggered a raw, civilian brand of pragmatism. The German High Command had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the American conscript. They were not facing a peasant army requiring aristocratic guidance, but a mobilized, industrialized society. These enlisted men were former construction foremen and assembly line supervisors, men culturally conditioned to troubleshoot broken systems on the fly. This localized initiative manifested in field improvisations that bypassed the bureaucratic chain of command entirely. When the hedgerows proved impassable for Sherman tanks, exposing their unarmored bellies as they tried to climb over, the American High Command had no immediate solution, but the enlisted men on the ground did. A cavalry sergeant named Curtis Cullen, alongside maintenance crews of the 2nd Armored Division, began salvaging heavy steel girders from German anti-tank obstacles littering the invasion beaches. Using field blowtorches, mechanics welded the jagged steel prongs directly onto the front of their tanks. They invented the Rhino modification in the mud of a French orchard, granting American armor the ability to violently shear straight through the thick earthen walls. An enlisted man's mechanical improvisation had abruptly shattered the German defensive geometry. Simultaneously, the Germans faced a devastating technological shock at the squad level. When a surviving American corporal took charge of a pinned-down unit, he did not rely on complex infantry maneuvers to dislodge the enemy. He unhooked an SCR-536 handy-talkie. Because the United States possessed the industrial capacity to push portable two-way radios down to the lowest tactical echelons, that corporal was instantly connected to a centralized grid of destruction. He relayed his coordinates, and within minutes, a localized firefight was decisively ended by a concentrated barrage from 105mm artillery batteries miles away. To the German officers surviving these encounters, the realization was chilling. The Americans did not need centuries of Prussian martial tradition to adapt, because they had effectively turned the frontline infantry squad into a highly connected, forward observation post. Killing the American officer did not stop the machine. It merely handed the trigger to the next man in the dirt. But this bloody, localized improvisation in the hedgerows was just the first symptom. It was a warning sign of a much larger, highly integrated, industrialized nightmare that was only just beginning to awaken against the Wehrmacht. The localized, desperate improvisations of enlisted men in the Normandy hedgerows were not an anomaly, but the first visible tremors of a deeply integrated, highly lethal system that the German High Command had completely failed to anticipate. When a surviving American corporal picked up a field radio to call for help, he was not merely signaling his immediate superiors. He was plugging into a revolutionary architecture of centralized firepower that fundamentally altered the physics of the battlefield. Prior to the Second World War, traditional artillery doctrine across European armies was a relatively rigid, mathematically cumbersome process. German artillery, for example, was highly effective, but traditionally tied to specific infantry divisions, relying heavily on pre-planned fire missions, rigid timetables, and strict hierarchical approval. If a German infantry commander encountered an unexpected threat, requesting a heavy artillery barrage required sending messages up the chain of command, securing approval, mapping the coordinates, and waiting for the designated batteries to adjust. It was a linear process that took critical time, times that allowed the enemy to maneuver, dig in, or retreat. The United States Army, severely lacking in combat experience but deeply influenced by industrial management theories, had spent the interwar years at the artillery school at Fort Sill, redesigning this entire process. They recognized that the traditional method was too slow for mechanized warfare. Instead of tying guns strictly to local infantry commanders, American doctrine centralized the mathematical control of the guns while aggressively decentralizing the authority to fire them. They created the Fire Direction Center, or FDC. This was effectively a battlefield server room, a mobile command post staffed by officers with slide rules, firing tables, and specialized maps. In the American system, an artillery battalion did not need to see the target. They only needed to listen to the FDC. The true terror of this system for the Wehrmacht was who was allowed to talk to the FDC. The American military had flooded the front lines with forward observers, junior officers, sergeants, and sometimes even enlisted men carrying portable radios. These observers were pushed down to the very edge of the combat zone, hiding in church steeples, crawling through ditches, or circling above the battlefield in unarmored Piper Cub liaison aircraft. When a German Panzer Grenadier unit began forming up in a forest to launch a counterattack, an American forward observer merely had to spot them, read the map coordinates, and speak a few numbers into a radio handset. That request bypassed the traditional, cumbersome chain of command and went straight to the Fire Direction Center. Within the FDC, the coordinates were instantly plotted, but the Americans did not just fire one battery, they weaponized the mathematics of time. Through a technique known as time on target, or TOT, the FDC could calculate the exact distance, trajectory, and flight time for multiple different artillery batteries scattered miles apart across the French countryside. The officers in the FDC would issue precise countdowns to the individual gun crews. A battery of heavy 155mm howitzers, located 5 miles away, might fire at exactly 1400 hours and 10 seconds. A battery of lighter 105mm guns, situated 2 miles closer, might fire at 1400 hours and 22 seconds. The shells traced vastly different parabolic arcs through the sky, but the mathematics ensured that every single high-explosive round from every single gun arrived at the exact same geographical coordinate at the exact same millisecond. For the German forces on the receiving end, the psychological and physical impact was beyond devastating. There was no ranging shot. There was no distant whistle of a single shell to warn the men to dive into their trenches. There was only absolute silence, instantly followed by the simultaneous detonation of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of artillery shells vaporizing a grid square. Entire German counterattacks, meticulously planned by veteran commanders and executed by elite troops, were completely wiped out before they ever saw a single American rifleman. During the German counteroffensive at Mortain in August 1944, elements of the elite SS Panzer divisions attempted to slice through the American lines and drive to the sea. They were met not by brilliant American infantry maneuvers, but by an unrelenting, mathematically perfect storm of high explosives. Forward observers on Hill 314 simply stared down at the German armor and called in the grid coordinates. The resulting time-on-target barrages physically disassembled the German armored thrust, leaving smoldering tanks and shattered infantry battalions trapped in the valleys. As these devastating engagements multiplied across France, a profound sense of bewilderment began to bleed into Wehrmacht field reports. The intelligence assessments that had so confidently dismissed the American conscript army as fragile and top-heavy were rapidly disintegrating under the weight of reality. Surviving German commanders, writing after-action reports to OB West, consistently highlighted a terrifying phenomenon: the American speed of communication. The Wehrmacht was highly professional, but its tactical nervous system was surprisingly antiquated. German units still relied heavily on field telephones, requiring miles of physical copper wire to be unspooled across the battlefield. When American artillery inevitably shattered those wires, German commanders were forced to rely on visual flares, motorcycle couriers, or men running on foot through the shrapnel to deliver orders. A German battalion commander could spend an hour just trying to find out what was happening on the other side of a ridge. The Americans, by contrast, were fighting a wireless war. The United States possessed the immense industrial capacity to miniaturize and mass-produce frequency modulation, or FM, radios. Devices like the SCR-300 backpack radio, universally known as the walkie-talkie, provided clear, static-free voice communication down to the platoon level. German intelligence officers intercepting American radio traffic were stunned by what they heard. They did not hear formal, coded military directives slowly transmitted by telegraph operators. They heard American sergeants talking casually to tank commanders, infantry lieutenants directly coordinating with artillery batteries, and forward observers adjusting fire in real time. The American military functioned as a hyper-connected nervous system. A German tactical maneuver that took hours to coordinate could be identified, reported, and neutralized by American artillery in a matter of minutes. The aristocratic German officer corps, trained to view warfare as a clash of willpower and operational art, slowly realized they were being systematically dismantled by teenagers with radios. But firepower and communication were only the sharp edge of the American system. The true center of gravity, the mechanism that made the American military an unstoppable force of nature, lay far behind the front lines, in an area the combat infantrymen rarely saw. It was the logistical umbilical cord. In the late summer of 1944, following the breakout from Normandy during Operation Cobra, the American and British armies began a massive, high-speed pursuit of the retreating Wehrmacht across France. This rapid advance presented a logistical nightmare of unprecedented proportions. A single American armored division on the move consumed roughly 600 tons of supplies every single day. They required tens of thousands of gallons of aviation-grade gasoline, vast quantities of high-explosive ammunition, medical supplies, and rations. In traditional military history, an army that advanced too quickly would inevitably outrun its supply lines, lose its momentum, and become highly vulnerable to a flanking counterattack. The German strategy heavily relied on this historical law of physics. They retreated, destroying the French railway network as they went, blowing up bridges and sabotaging rail yards, fully expecting the heavy American mechanized forces to grind to a halt within a few weeks due to starvation and lack of fuel. The German high command fundamentally failed to grasp the sheer industrial scale and ruthless efficiency of the American quartermaster. When the railways were destroyed, the United States simply bypassed them by inventing a rolling highway. They organized the Red Ball Express. This was a massive, relentlessly managed convoy system utilizing over nearly 6,000 2.5-ton trucks, universally known as the Deuce and a Half. Operating on a strictly enforced one-way loop that eventually stretched from the port of Cherbourg all the way to the front lines near the German border, the Red Ball Express became an artery of mechanical lifeblood. The operation was a triumph of industrial management applied to a combat zone. The routes were closed to all civilian and non-military traffic. Military police guarded the intersections. The trucks ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, often driving at night with their headlights taped over with narrow slits to avoid attracting Luftwaffe strafing runs. The drivers, over 75% of whom were African-American soldiers serving in segregated quartermaster units, endured grueling, sleep-deprived shifts, pushing their heavily loaded vehicles at 40 miles per hour over cratered, ruined roads. When tires blew out or engines seized, maintenance crews positioned along the route swapped the parts or pushed the vehicles into the ditch to keep the convoy moving. At its peak, the Red Ball Express delivered over 12,000 tons of supplies to the front lines every single day. To the German forces desperately trying to establish a new defensive line, the American advance seemed to defy the laws of military logistics. The fuel kept flowing, the artillery shells kept falling, and the momentum never broke. Furthermore, the American logistical behemoth possessed a terrifying capacity for regeneration. The Wehrmacht produced some of the most technologically advanced and lethal tanks of the war, such as the Tiger and the Panther. But these German machines were essentially bespoke, artisanal weapons. They were over-engineered, incredibly complex, and heavily reliant on specialized parts. When a Panther tank broke down or suffered battle damage, it often had to be loaded onto a train and shipped back to a factory in Germany for repairs, effectively removing it from the war for months. The American military approached equipment fundamentally differently. The M4 Sherman tank was not designed to be the ultimate invincible battlefield predator. It was designed to be mass-produced, easily transported across an ocean, and, crucially, repaired in the field. The Sherman utilized highly standardized, interchangeable parts. Behind the advancing American divisions trailed massive ordnance maintenance companies. These were mobile factories staffed by drafted mechanics, welders, and engineers. When an American tank was knocked out by a German anti-tank gun, the battle was not the end of its life cycle. Heavy recovery vehicles would drag the smoking chassis back to a maintenance depot. Within 48 hours, American mechanics would use blowtorches to cut away the damaged steel, weld a new armor plate over the hole, hose the blood and debris out of the interior, drop in a fresh engine, and hand the keys to a newly arrived replacement crew. This regenerative capacity inflicted a deep psychological toll on the German defenders. A veteran German anti-tank crew might fight brilliantly, successfully destroying 3 American tanks in a desperate delaying action on a Monday. But by Wednesday, because of the relentless efficiency of the American logistical and maintenance network, those exact same 3 tanks, patched and recrewed, would be rolling back toward their positions. The Wehrmacht was fighting an enemy that simply absorbed casualties and instantly replaced them, treating the destruction of heavy armor not as a tactical defeat, but merely as a temporary inventory deficit. By the autumn of 1944, a profound cultural realization had taken hold within the surviving echelons of the German military intelligence apparatus. The aristocratic officers who had sneered at the American conscript army realized that their centuries-old philosophy of war was practically obsolete. The German doctrine of Auftragstaktik created brilliant tactical warriors, men who could read the terrain, execute daring flanking maneuvers, and fight with unparalleled ferocity. But the United States had not come to Europe to fight a war of elegant tactical maneuvers. They had come to execute a massive, heavily armed engineering project. The American system did not require its frontline infantry to possess the martial genius of a Prussian elite. It only required them to move forward, locate the enemy, and hold their ground long enough for the industrial machine to apply overwhelming, calculated violence. The true American warriors were the nameless logisticians, organizing fuel convoys in the rear, the radio operators maintaining communication grids, the artillery officers plotting mathematical coordinates, and the mechanics welding steel in the mud. The United States had successfully modeled its military after its most powerful civilian corporations, treating the European theater as a hostile market to be aggressively overwhelmed through sheer volume, rapid communication, and uninterrupted supply chains. No matter how brilliantly a German commander maneuvered, no matter how many casualties his veteran troops inflicted in a localized ambush, he could not overcome the unrelenting, mechanical pressure of the American advance. The Wehrmacht was being crushed not by superior bravery, but by an avalanche of high explosives, standardized replacement parts, and radio frequencies. The American war machine appeared completely flawless, a hyper-efficient juggernaut, steadily erasing the Third Reich from the map. But this vast, industrialized behemoth was built on a deeply hidden vulnerability. Treating war purely as a mathematical equation of logistics and firepower required specific environmental conditions to function. The American system required clear skies to maintain its devastating air cover. It required solid roads to keep the thousands of supply trucks rolling. It required unbroken momentum to prevent the immense logistical tail from tangling upon itself. As the autumn rains turned to the bitter, freezing sleet of November 1944, the Allied advance began to stretch dangerously thin. The dense, ancient pines of the Hurtgen forest neutralized the American artillery advantage, forcing the infantry into brutal, primitive combat that the machine could not solve from a distance. The supply lines, now stretching hundreds of miles from the ports, began to choke in the deep mud and freezing temperatures. Deep within the supposedly impenetrable Ardennes forest, the German high command observed this slowing momentum. They understood that the American machine was a creature of ideal conditions. If the weather grounded the aircraft, if the terrain blinded the radios, and if the cold froze the engines, the Americans would be stripped of their technological shield. The Wehrmacht prepared to launch a massive, desperate counterstroke into the winter fog, intending to prove that when the engines failed and the radios went dead, the war would once again belong to the men who fought in the dark. As that winter fog settled over the front lines, it exposed the deepest, most critical vulnerability of the American way of war. By late November 1944, the Allied advance had slammed into a geographical and logistical wall. The United States Army treated combat almost entirely as a logistical and engineering equation, a complex system engineered for continuous momentum and frictionless supply. But as the armored columns pushed hundreds of miles away from the captured French ports, that equation began to violently break down. The famed Red Ball Express began cannibalizing itself. Transport trucks were burning more aviation-grade gasoline just navigating the cratered, muddy roads to the front than they were actually delivering to the tanks. This sudden logistical strangulation instantly neutralized the core of American tactical doctrine: overwhelming, centralized firepower. The fire direction centers, which had mathematically disassembled German counterattacks throughout the summer, suddenly went quiet. Artillery batteries were placed on strictly enforced rationing. A 105mm howitzer crew that had routinely fired hundreds of high-explosive rounds a day during the Normandy breakout was suddenly restricted to as few as 3 shells per day. Simultaneously, heavy overcast skies and freezing rain effectively blinded the Allied air forces, grounding the crucial fighter bombers that served as flying artillery. When the heavy guns fell silent and the skies closed, the industrialized shield simply evaporated. The immense burden of the war was violently transferred back onto the shoulders of the raw, under-equipped infantrymen. Without an infinite supply of high explosives to clear the path, the American rifleman was forced into grueling, primitive, close-quarters attrition, the exact type of warfare the entire system was explicitly designed to prevent. This freezing halt revealed just how resource-dependent the American soldier actually was. This was not an army of flawless, self-sustaining super soldiers. They were drafted civilians who required a constant, massive stream of dry socks, winter overcoats, and hot rations just to remain combat effective. Because those critical supplies were trapped in traffic jams miles to the rear, American divisions began bleeding out from the elements before a single shot was fired. In the waterlogged, freezing trenches along the German border, non-combat casualties skyrocketed as trenchfoot, frostbite, and pneumonia decimated the frontline rifle companies. Across the quiet, frozen front line, German intelligence officers meticulously documented this systemic paralysis. They realized they were not facing an invincible force of nature, but a machine that possessed a fatal design flaw. The American military operated like a deep-sea diver. It wielded immense destructive power, but it was entirely dependent on a fragile, highly vulnerable umbilical cord stretching back to the surface. Sever that cord, and the diver suffocates. German planners mapped out this exact logistical vulnerability. They understood that defeating the United States in a conventional, open-air battle of attrition was a mathematical impossibility. But if they could weaponize the dense geography of the Ardennes, trap the American infantry far away from their supply depots, and strike exactly when the winter weather completely neutralized the Allied air cover, the entire American juggernaut could be shattered. Under the cover of heavy snow and absolute radio silence, the Wehrmacht waited for the perfect storm. On the morning of December 16, 1944, that perfect storm violently detonated across the Ardennes. Over 200,000 German troops, spearheaded by heavy panzer divisions, smashed into a thin, 80-mile stretch of the American line. They struck the exact units the winter weather had already compromised: exhausted divisions recovering from the meat grinder of the Hurtgen forest, and green, untested formations that had only just arrived in Europe. Under the cover of heavy fog that grounded all Allied aircraft and blinded the forward observers, the Wehrmacht unleashed a massive, synchronized assault designed to rip straight through the Allied lines and capture the critical supply depots at Antwerp. For the first 48 hours, the German intelligence models seemed entirely validated. The sheer weight of the armored thrust shattered the American front. Communications were severed. Entire battalions were surrounded in the snow. Senior American commanders were completely cut off from their units, staring at headquarters maps that no longer represented reality. According to Berlin's doctrine, this was the fatal moment. Deprived of centralized command, artillery support, and clear operational orders, the disorganized remnants of the American infantry were supposed to succumb to tactical paralysis. But the American military apparatus did not paralyze. It atomized. As the formal chain of command disintegrated, the decentralized, pragmatic culture of the drafted civilian army instantly took over at the lowest possible level. The German armored spearheads, bound to strict operational timetables and restricted to the narrow, icy roads of the Ardennes, suddenly found themselves bleeding time. They were not being stopped by coordinated divisions, but by isolated ad hoc pockets of resistance, formed by men who were never supposed to be in direct combat. As panzers pushed deep into the rear echelons, they ran headlong into the logistical tail of the American machine. Supply clerks, mess hall cooks, radio repairmen, and motor pool mechanics picked up discarded M1 Garands and formed desperate roadblocks. At critical choke points, small squads of combat engineers operated entirely on their own initiative. Without waiting for authorization from a general who was trapped miles away, a 20-year-old sergeant would wire a bridge over the Ourcq or Amblève rivers with high explosives and detonate it directly in the face of an advancing column of Tiger tanks. These isolated, desperate actions were not grand tactical victories, and most of these improvised units were eventually overrun. But they introduced an unbearable level of friction into the highly synchronized German machine. A platoon of quartermasters holding a vital crossroads for just 6 hours meant a German panzer division missed its critical fuel rendezvous. A blown bridge forced an entire armored column to detour down narrow, muddy logging trails, burning precious gasoline and losing an entire day. The Germans had expected to drive through a vacuum. Instead, they were fighting 1,000 disconnected, localized brawls. This chaotic, grassroots defense bought the American command structure the one resource it desperately needed: time. While the stragglers and engineers bled to slow the German advance, the vast American logistical network executed a maneuver that the German High Command had mathematically calculated was physically impossible. General George S. Patton, commanding the Third Army, was ordered to relieve the besieged crossroads town of Bastogne. To achieve this, Patton had to disengage an entire corps from active combat, pivot a massive industrialized army 90 degrees, and drive north over icy roads in the middle of a blizzard. For a traditional European army, redeploying hundreds of thousands of men and their heavy equipment in winter would take weeks of meticulous planning. The American logistical machine did it in days. Convoys of trucks drove endlessly through the freezing nights, shifting thousands of tons of fuel, artillery shells, and winter gear, while military police manually directed bumper-to-bumper armored traffic at frozen intersections. By the time the skies finally cleared and the lethal American air power returned, Patton's forces were already smashing into the southern flank of the German Bulge. The massive Wehrmacht gamble in the Ardennes ultimately collapsed. Yet it did not fail because the initial German strategic plan was tactically flawed, or because their armored divisions lacked lethality. It failed because the German intelligence apparatus fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the men executing the American defense. That catastrophic misunderstanding brings us full circle to the smoldering desert of Kasserine Pass in early 1943. When German intelligence officers interrogated captured Americans and dismissed them as fundamentally unfit for mechanized warfare, they were making a fatal, culturally arrogant miscalculation. They looked at the green, confused draftees and saw an army entirely devoid of the aristocratic, centuries-old Prussian martial tradition. They assumed that because the Americans relied heavily on rigid field manuals and lacked a deeply ingrained warrior ethos, their command structure would permanently shatter under pressure. But by the spring of 1945, as those same supposedly fragile civilian soldiers crossed the Rhine and systematically dismantled the remnants of the Wehrmacht, the colossal failure of German military arithmetic was fully exposed. The German General Staff had evaluated the United States Army strictly through the narrow, rigid lens of traditional European militarism. They believed that war was an art form, mastered only by a professional warrior caste. They completely missed the fact that a rapidly mobilized, industrialized society had produced a differently wired kind of combatant. The United States did not attempt to build a traditional army of elite tactical purists. Instead, it weaponized its own cultural DNA. The American military machine succeeded precisely because it was populated by former assembly line workers, mechanics, and farmers, men culturally conditioned to troubleshoot broken systems and improvise without waiting for aristocratic permission. When the rigid, top-down chain of command inevitably broke down, empowered non-commissioned officers and drafted teenagers simply treated the chaotic battlefield as a lethal engineering problem. They bypassed the bureaucracy, utilized their widespread mechanical literacy, and leveraged a revolutionary communication grid to call down absolute destruction. This was the ultimate thematic clash of the Western Front, a violent collision between traditional martial heritage and ruthless industrial pragmatism. The German military possessed brilliant tactical commanders and technologically sophisticated armor, but they were ultimately ground into dust by a highly adaptable, decentralized organism that backed its frontline problem solvers with an unrelenting, regenerating supply chain. The Wehrmacht learned too late that adaptability, civilian mechanical intuition, and mass production could decisively overpower centuries of strict martial tradition. The American draft force did not need to outmaneuver the German veteran. They simply needed to outsustain, outcommunicate, and outproduce him. This brutal realization fundamentally redefines the anatomy of the Allied victory, leading directly to the ultimate truth of the European theater. The German officer corps spent the entirety of the Second World War searching for the perfect warrior, an aristocratic ideal forged in iron discipline, martial lineage, and tactical brilliance. They surveyed the battlefields of Europe, expecting an adversary who understood war as a glorious, centuries-old art form. Instead, they were systematically dismantled by a nation of drafted mechanics, school teachers, and factory workers who viewed combat not as a sacred calling, but as a violent, deeply practical problem that required a heavily armed, highly synchronized solution. The Wehrmacht built a traditional army designed to win individual battles through sheer military genius. The United States built a relentless, industrialized engine of destruction designed to win the war, and handed the keys to ordinary men who simply wanted to fix the problem and go home.